Thank you, Steve, for that very kind introduction. I do have a very funny story about that Malaysian trip there, because that was 6 a.m. in the morning. I do remember that somebody got out of bed at that time and walked behind me during me giving my presentation. But anyway, just before I start, I want to say thanks very much for the organisers to inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I also want to say what a great day it's been as well. I've really enjoyed all the sessions this morning and this afternoon, the ones that I've sat in. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well, so congratulations on the conference as well, Steve. I realise as well, I've never been in a position, but it's that kind of famous phrase, isn't it? I'm the only thing that's kind of standing between you and getting your dinner. So, although that sounds as if I don't actually want to get any dinner, obviously I do too. So I will try and keep to time with these. I've put a few new slides in for this particular session. Steve, I also wanted to thank you, the organisers. You didn't push me too hard about giving you an abstract for this particular talk. I mean, it was a bit last minute. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to talk about. The title of the conference is quite open, about learning landscapes. And there are two kind of themes that I wanted to pick up on thinking about that. They're really about the way that the educational landscape, the digital landscape and the learning landscape are changing and how we deal with managing that change. And I'm going to pick up on two areas there, two domains. One is around patterns and one is around analytics, and hopefully have some insights around that. And I hope as well to touch on some of the issues that were brought up in the sessions this morning, particularly with Gronya and also with Doug with badges. So when I say change, well, what do I really mean by change? And there are lots of different ways of thinking about change. The one that I quite like to start with, though, is just think about technological change and process change. This is probably familiar to everyone, I hope. Maybe not what's on it, but the Gartner hype cycle. So the Gartner hype cycle is Gartner every year produces forward-looking, a kind of horizon-scanning view of what technologies are coming in onto our radar, which technologies are at what they call the peak of inflated expectations, and those which are slowly starting to disappear you slightly put me off there, Steve, which are disappearing at the trough of disillusionment, only to reappear on what they call the slope of enlightenment, and finally where we all hope to make money, or certainly companies would do when they reach the plateau of productivity. So this is produced every year, and I think if you go back, I won't flick through them, but if you go back, you can see a wealth, an enormous range of technologies have been coming through. I looked back at one when I first started really kind of working with digital technologies back in, well, really 2006, 5, 6, looking at the Gartner curve then. Things on the Gartner curve were what? Wikis, blogs, all those technologies, which today seem so boring and so ordinary. And so we have a whole host of new ones. And indeed, Steve, you mentioned that I've done quite a lot of work in virtual worlds. And sadly, when I look at the Gartner curve now, I see where virtual worlds are, which is why I probably won't be speaking about them today. Bang, right in the trough of disillusionment. So all I wanted to say about this slide really was just there are a lot of technologies that are coming through and we have to deal with them. A lot of these technologies you'll recognise because they do affect the way that we do things in education, the way we do things within our institutions. And they are where we look sometimes for inspiration in changing what we do and inspiration in terms of innovation. But change isn't merely about the number of things coming, it's also about the speed at which things come. So I'll use Moore's law as an example. Basically the number of transistors on a chip doubles every 2 years. That still holds true if you talk to most engineers. In fact, most engineers, if you speak to them, will say, actually, it is faster than that now. In fact, the speed of that has increased. This is on a logarithmic plot, by the way, that the speed of change is increasing. In fact, computing power now is doubling every year. So change is also about speed. So we have to deal with not just the number of things that are coming, but also the speed of things. So if you've ever had a chance to read Ray Kurzweil's book on The Singularity is Near, he is a big person in the artificial intelligence domain, then he suggests that technological change is exponential, not linear. And he goes through a series of different graphical representations of evolution, also looking at technological change to back that up. We could argue about whether that's true or not, but it kind of, what he says is that if we look where we are on that graph of exponential change, he says that we're only just about reaching the knee of the curve, he calls it. So if you think things are changing quickly now, then hold on, because you haven't even got on the ride yet. So things are going to be changing ever faster. So how do we think about change? How do we deal with change? Cue light classical music in the background. So, I mean, institutions are not particularly fantastic at dealing with change. Some are better, and I think we've slowly realised, for those of us who work, particularly I think in the higher education sector, that we have to acknowledge that things will shift the way that we actually do business, and that business is now an educational business as well. I mean, this is kind of classical, we find that there are, well, I would say 4 stages of acceptance to technology when it comes into the institution. It's that one of there's one of ignorance. People hardly even know it's there. It's not actually on the radar. Then there's one of, yes, I can see there's some technology over there, but it's actually, don't bother me, I'm busy teaching, it is completely irrelevant to us. And then, yes, it's important, technology is important, but of course that actually isn't for us. And then the final stage is, look, I always told you it was important, so don't contradict me on that. So we have, this is kind of a standard cycle, I think, about the way that institutions deal with technology, and in some ways deal with innovation. And when we speak about innovation and technology together, and I think technology is a big driver of innovation, then there are 2 types classically of innovation that we read about. One is a sustaining type of innovation, and the other is a disruptive. So sustaining is an innovation that comes in and essentially fits with your current business model. So it sustains what you're already doing. So I can pick, for example, in education, I would suggest that the VLE is one of those sustaining technologies which carries on the business of doing what we already kind of expect. It's institutionally controlled. It's institutionally controlled to the level that it fits in with our students' record database. It fits in with all sorts of other systems of institutional control. Then we have disruptive technologies, which gets everybody a little bit more excited because it's about innovation, entrepreneurialism, and change. So in terms of disruptive technologies, I mean, outside of education, the classic case that everybody will bring up is probably Kodak and how its business failed in that it didn't deal with the change from film. Its own business model was based on what's called a razor blade model, where they sold film at a very high profit margin. Eventually, they in fact did make the first prototype digital camera. They decided, oops, let's not develop that because that might disturb our current high profit business model, only to find that other people moved in and they lost that market share, and Kodak, essentially, as you probably have all read recently, it has collapsed. So in education, when we've talked about disruptive technologies, some of those that are raised as being disruptive, and again, there is some argument about whether they really have been disruptive or not, are things like social media. Web 2.0 came in, was one of the big areas. Now about open networks and openness, and I think OERs as well are seen as being disruptive as well. It's interesting to see that one way of containing disruptive innovation is to spin off disruptive innovations as a side part of a particular business. Now, potentially, that might be what we are seeing with massive open online courses. Is that a way that institutions now are quickly jumping onto the bandwagon of massively open online courses to contain the disruptive element within those big consortia now placing on the education system itself? So again, something maybe to discuss over dinner, but I won't go into that right now. And it's not just technology being disruptive in terms of the way that we do the business, it's also thinking about where we are training and thinking about people being in the future. So I was just in Miles' talk, and Miles talked about children, ICT, the ICT curriculum and the changes there. So if I take that to higher education and then I look ahead to what jobs are people going to be doing in the coming years, well, here's a list. So I don't think any of us do any of these jobs yet, do we? But they're interesting. This is actually quite a big study that was carried out looking at what jobs will be here by 2030. When they actually then took those out to survey and asked people which of the top 5 they actually wanted to see arrive, and these are the top 5 jobs that people wanted to see. So perhaps unsurprisingly, old age wellness manager is there considering the demographic change we're experiencing at the moment. But things like vertical farmer, basically hydroponics in big buildings, nanomedics, fairly self-explanatory, climate change reversal specialist, I love that, and new scientist ethicist. So Fantastic. It's a really good read, and I recommend everybody to have a little look at that, because what it says is something about institutions. It says, well, you know, what are universities for, what are institutions for, and what are they training people for, and are they adapted to that? How are they working with technologies, and how are they dealing with some of the challenges that are coming along? And we talked a lot about challenges this morning. I mean, Gronya raised a few, and I think I've echoed some of those here as well, that we do have some big challenges ahead of us. Looking at what business models there are for the future and how sustainable are they. I mean, all of that has been thrown up in the air again by massive open online courses. There's a big thing at the moment around big data as well, and about the amount of data that now is available to be mined. And it's not just data that is out there that we're using through Facebook, it is now educational data as well. And the tools are now there to start to see patterns and make sense of it. So all those things and all those digital traces, all that privacy, all that about our digital identity perhaps we thought was protected, would never really anybody would trace back, is now becoming available to be used, potentially for good, but also to be abused and potentially exploited. The other one is a big demographic shift going on, and how do we deal with that? Surely education and educational institutions should be thinking about where we go with that. There's a shift, that shift indeed to lifelong learning, and thinking as well about the links between informal and formal learning, and getting the best benefit out of an ageing population as well. Where do we link that ageing population in and keep them inside the loop, especially as our ages of retirement are now all shifting up? And that's a global trend. I mean, this is the European year of, I'm not sure what it is, ageing or older people, but that is a growing trend as well. And I think that links as well. Again, this has been raised, the whole issues around digital literacy. It was raised in relation to Jenkins and participatory culture, and I think it's a really good, I mean, I really like that paper that Jenkins produced, and I really like those areas that he picked upon, and I mean, I've used that in other talks as well, and I think that everyone gives that a nod of approval and said, yes, that's where we want to be going. So, yes, digital literacy in terms of participation, but also digital literacy in terms of exclusion and how we bridge a growing digital divide. I work on two very big projects at the moment, European projects, and we're looking at the digital divide that is appearing in the ageing population. How do we keep that older population up to speed with the way things are changing? And this is very simple things as well to some extent. If we think about particularly, okay, it's UK centric, but when the checkbook is going to disappear in 2017, that's going to be a bit of a shock for a certain part of this population. And are we ready for that? It's one thing thinking about the digital switch over the televisions. It's another thinking about not having access to your bank account and your banking, and who proxies for you if that occurs. So I think digital literacy is one of those hidden things that we speak a lot about, but it's something that we really have to put a lot of effort to it. And then finally as well, okay, it relates back again, I think, to something about what the universities are and the way that we deliver education, is the relevance. And that relates back again to those jobs that I just put up there on the screen. What is the relevance of an institution if we think those jobs are coming along? So it says a lot about what is the value proposition there from higher education. Is it a good one? Why come to the University of Surrey? Why come to the University of Plymouth? What is the value proposition, and what is the value chain or value network that you cite yourself within when you come into a higher education institution? So these are big questions, and there are big challenges we're facing, and we have to kind of think about what are the best ways to deal with that and the changes and the pressures externally to us. So I'm not going to solve all of those. You'll be sad to hear in the next 20 minutes or so. But I do want to speak about a couple of areas that I think are important in terms of dealing with change and are areas that we need to think about, and I think they are trends that are coming. The first one that I want to speak about is actually design. And design has been coming up, well, for me, maybe my ears have been open to this, but design seems to come up a lot now in education. Thinking about learning design, thinking about space design, many different areas. So design for me is a kind of key word. And when we think about design, then it's, as Herbert Simon said, everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. Now that's a nice statement, because what it says is that we are all designers. And I think that has been a growing trend, is to see that design is not a craft that is beyond all of us to participate in and reflect on. So I want to talk a little bit about design. I'm going to do it through an area that I've been interested in for quite some time, and it's about pattern languages and design patterns. So I've put a particular book up, which is probably the originator of the area of design patterns. I'll try and give you an overview of it, and I'm happy to speak further about it later. I'll try and give you an overview of the way that I think design patterns work and what they do. But this book here, Pattern Languages, and if you get a chance to read it or get hold of it, it's a beautiful book. It's almost like a piece of poetry rather than a design language. But Christopher Alexander is an architect, so he got together with some other experts in the architectural field, and he said that basically that there is a lot of design knowledge there in architecture that we should be able to extract and document and give. I'm speaking on his behalf here, but that they could extract and give to us so that we could use this design knowledge to essentially build things ourselves, that we could pass this knowledge on, that we could give design patterns or patterns of design to us in an understandable form to allow us to do, in his particular domain of expertise, was architecture. So this book is made up of 256 design patterns about building things, and building things from how do you design a city and the social spaces in a city, all the way down to where you stick a door in a room. So here's a whole pattern language that links these patterns together, which would allow any one of us to read this book and theoretically to go and build our own home. Not any home, but one that is well designed, that is based on a large body of architectural knowledge. So it's a challenge, and if you are interested, people have tried to do this and use this book to build homes. The only failing, I can tell you now, the only failing is, yes, it does work. The only problem is that this book misses one thing, and that's the aesthetics of design. So you build a very practical, wonderful home, but it looks rubbish. So what do his patterns look like? I mean, how does he... I mean, I said they're like poetry, but here's one of the design patterns from the book, just to give you a flavour. It's a very simple one. It's called Light on Two Sides of Every Room, and it's pattern 159. And it says, basically, when people have a choice, people always gravitate to those rooms which have light on two sides, and leave rooms which are lit only from one side, unused and empty. Therefore, and there's the solution to this kind of problem that we see of how people orientate themselves about a room, is make sure that each room has at least two sides where it has light coming into it. So it's a very simple, beautiful pattern, nicely written. It's a pattern 159. If I put the full pattern here, it would link into the other related patterns to help you that are at that level of design. And the way that that is formed is essentially, it's a solution to a problem with a context. So all patterns and all design patterns are built around that simple premise: solution, context, design. And it's beautiful because what that pattern does is it's kind of timeless and works over many different situations. So if you think about light on two sides of a room and using that design pattern, designing with it, then it doesn't tell you the size of the windows, it doesn't tell you the material of the windows. So you can think from church through to modern design. So those patterns show that they exist over a period of time and over a period of change. So they're a way to capture expert knowledge and expert design knowledge and allow us to use it and add our own interpretation of that within the confines of the context of that particular problem. So Alexander describes these as a pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. So it's a very nice design approach. And what they do is they capture and reuse expert design knowledge. You build a common terminology for design as well, and there's enough abstraction for you to take design patterns away and solve novel problems. So it's a creative rather than a derivative use of design knowledge. And I won't go into this too deeply, but we developed a methodology for actually getting and building design patterns around workshops and bringing experts together in a domain to talk about their successful practice and go through essentially a set of workshops. One is about design narratives, looking at narratives of the way people do design things. looking at then abstracting that knowledge, so building the design patterns, and then testing and iterating them by then going through a scenarios workshop, so coming with novel problems and looking at how we can apply those. So we built a particular methodology for that as well. And a set of activities which help to support that. So there's a toolkit that supports the activity of actually building those design patterns. And these really are just, what I wanted to say here is this is a way of doing something that is, for me, deliberately human. So it's something about bringing people together in a grounded way to abstract knowledge. So there's something about that which is sharing knowledge in a very human way, a very participatory way, which gives it its power and its strength. It's also a very open way of developing knowledge and design knowledge because it allows for reiteration. So it closes the loop in that it allows development of design knowledge, the testing of it, and that testing can go back into the redesign of those particular patterns as well. So again, there's like a fail-safe in some respects, which is unlike good practices which we often try and find, which tend to be very static, which tend to be locked, and actually tend to be rather decontextualized, to be quite frank, and have limited value. Whereas with a pattern, you have something which is open, iterative, and is able to change over time. And Gronya challenged me to get something in about digital identity. Well, this is the best I could do. We've developed design patterns in various different domains. I talked originally there about architecture and about Christopher Alexander and his design patterns, probably the father of it all. The next set of design patterns that came out later was around programming and object-oriented programming. So there's a very famous book from the Gang of Four about design patterns for object-oriented programming. There are design pattern languages now there are pedagogical patterns. And Lorelei has been interested in that recently. We've done patterns for feedback and assessment, for running seminars, for computer-supported collaborative learning. We did design patterns for teaching in virtual worlds. So there are a whole host of languages and design languages out there that are providing a base set of solutions to problems in context to allow you to challenge novel problems. This is a particular design language that, from a project I did some time ago now, but which looking at managing digital identity and looking at how Web 2.0 is changing our notion of online identity and what the effect was, and how people might want to design the way that they work with their online identity. It's available here, but interesting. I just wanted to point out that we did have one up here called Wear Your Skills. So this was a design pattern which was quite interesting. It was actually about badges. It was about the whole thing about how you should make your skills visible, and is about the badges would be a very, very good way to do that. So that's quite nice after this morning's talk that I'm able to point that one out. But there's a whole series of patterns here. So if you want to have a look at those, there's a URL there which you can actually have a look at those. Okay, so that was kind of, this talk is a little bit in two parts. In some respects, that was the first part of my talk, and that was about something, as I said again, which is about a human way to think about design and a way to think about coming together and a way to be building things that maybe are resilient or work with change and work with those pressures on the institution and work with it at quite an interesting level as well, in that you can work from interesting levels, in that you can work from very high level, so macro level stuff. We've done stuff with social action, all the way down to patterns which work at the social level, at designing seminars and designing particular and solving particular educational problems as well. The next part of my talk really just goes back to that issue about technology coming along very fast, and one of the things that technology is doing, or one of the side effects of technology now, is about the amount of data that we actually are producing. And the huge amounts of data. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here, probably all aware of it, we read a lot about it. And there are figures everywhere. This is just one that I just picked out, I think from the McKinsey report, just about the amount of information we've actually got. I'd never actually heard of a zettabyte till I'd read this, but apparently in 2009 we had 0.8 of them, 800 billion gigabytes, now that I understand, and then by 2020 we're predicting 35 zettabytes. Well, okay, it just means a hell of a lot of information to me, that huge amounts, okay. And What's in that information? Well, it's the stuff that's just been siloed away, that's gone to data warehouses. It's all the, what was it, Miles, you said, how does Google store its data and all that? Well, when we find out, we'll be able to access all this messy stuff they've got. It's all our social networks, it's all those user profiles, all those posts we've been making. It's all those digital traces of those online, hyper online transactions that we've been making. All that data that nobody's really bothered about, nobody could actually see any value in, is now, I've read, termed the new oil. And how do we mine this new oil as well? How do we get value out of it? And you've probably heard a lot about big data, this idea about that it's a qualitative shift in what we understand is in those data and what pattern. So move away from kind of data mining towards something which is about patterns of data and what we can pluck out of that. And if we think the data is going to get any less, well, it isn't, is it? Because we're just producing even more, because we're now into the Internet of Things. Everything we do is now being joined to the Internet. So wearable devices, we've got the new Apple Watch thing coming out. I mean, these are all life-logging bits of information that are appearing, which are sold to us many ways about the benefits of those. So the benefits being that our objects can then talk to each other while we're not around and do things for us when we're not there. So our alarm clock knows when we've got up late, which can tell the person at the ticket, can tell the ticket machine to change our ticket, and so on and so forth. And these are meant to be benefits. But I think as well, we are well to be suspicious of what all this data is and what this does. I mean, I couldn't really believe this statistic, but I assure you that I did take it from a Cisco brochure, is that by 2011, 20 typical households apparently were capable of generating more traffic than the entire internet in 2008. Incredible. I mean, I don't know, I might have to check that later, but if anyone wants to check that now. But so that data is growing. And what is scary is that data is now, we can now mine that data. So that information is becoming available. So I talked a little bit about big data. So big corporations now, as you probably see, are going out and looking at what they can mine from that information. What kind of business intelligence can they get out of our data? So they are mining it and using various kinds of algorithms, machine learning, etc., to pull meaning out of that, and applying discourse analysis tools to try and put some semantic knowledge into that. And I think one of the things that's happened, and I've noticed this on my radar, is that this has now been kind of come into the educational arena as well. It's crept into the way that institutions see themselves and managing themselves. So if we talk about big data, we tend to associate that more largely with corporations there. But it's coming inside institutions now in terms of us thinking about business intelligence. So I don't know how many of you work with management teams or senior management teams, but I spend a lot of time discussing things like KPIs and what performance indicators we should be looking at. And also relates back to this idea that we should have plenty of business, we should be looking at business intelligence. So they're the fairly standard things about how do we identify new opportunities for our institutions, what are our risks and our performance, how do we drive up productivity, how do we understand our customers, our students, and how do we support a more varied and dynamic business needs. So how do we be competitive in the educational marketplace? How do we get real-time data? How do we visualise how our institution is working? How do we visualise what's happening? And that now, more interestingly, I hope, has shifted over to this idea now of analytics. So I think there are a lot of there is a move now towards looking at that data in terms of not just simply at the macro level, but what that means down at the micro level. So George Siemens put this up. This is part of the, I think this was at the LAC conference in 2011. He put this together. And he gives an idea of what types of analytics are out there at the moment. Has anybody come across or used analytics just out of interest? Oh, right, okay, quite. So it is on the radar. Okay. So, I mean, he gives an interesting differentiation between looking at learning analytics, so he's looking down at the micro level, up to the academic analytics, which is looking more at the way the institutions run themselves. So from the course level, looking at social networks, conceptual development, through departments, up to institutional level, the learner profiles, and all the way up to regional, national, and international. And it's quite useful because it differentiates out where there might be value in starting to look at the amount of educational data that we actually are collecting. And indeed, we are collecting more and more. It goes back to the idea that we use more and more institutional systems, and our learners spend more and more time using digital resources and using online systems as well. So they are producing more and more data. And this is a very nice, if you've not had a chance to read it, it's a really nice series that CETIS put together on analytics for teaching practice. A really good read and really good summary of where analytics are at the moment. This I've taken from Diagraphis, which I can't remember which number this one is, volume 1, number 10. It's a very nice one about teaching practice and analytics. And he talks, and I agree with this, he talks about 3 types of intervention there. The efficiency and the wider functioning of the institution, I've talked a little bit about that. Enhanced regulation of the teaching and learning environment, I've intimated a little bit of that as well. And methods and tools intended to help lecturers carry out their tasks more effectively. And I think he's right in saying this is where analytics has the potential to be a useful tool in terms of teaching practice, which is where we want to get to, really. And what kind of benefits are we suggesting from using analytics, if we can get any benefits, is that we should get some kind of indicators and predictive models for, the classic example quoted is around additional learning support, and then maybe we can reduce student attrition, we can look at graduate attributes, and also think about how we can develop scalable methods for enhancing the teaching practice that is going on within the institution. And basically, I mean, this is a crude model, but just to give a visual idea about how analytics working is that learners producing data producing a set of metrics. Who produces their metrics and what those metrics are, well, that's something for discussion. There is then an intervention, and that goes back round to learners. So it's not, I mean, somebody else made this, it's not dissimilar to Kolb's learning cycle, strangely. The idea of that active experimentation is that, yes, you can see the value there. So I think what you've got is learners' data. You have some reflection, metrics intervention, but you want trends and predictions. That's where it starts to get more exciting. Otherwise, you really are just doing you really are just doing data mining, which we've probably been doing for quite some time and always have been. It's when we build those models and start to predict things that I think we are moving into a new area. And analytics is a very young field because it's only starting to be theoretically underpinned by different models of understanding what the pedagogy might be, what kind of analysis might bear fruit in terms of building metrics and algorithms, and how automated we dare let such a system be. So, and I make a comment there as well, I think just the point of analytics is to provide, and it's important to remember that, actionable insights. Actionable insights. And when I say that, I mean, for example, what would we really want from something like analytics is maybe well, I wouldn't say the Holy Grail, but one of the key things of personalised learning is to be able to change the pace of learning, which we find very difficult to do at the moment. We step people through learning generally. But the remediation acceleration of learning is a potential big win for analytics. So there are some things to look at and aim for. So I say that, I don't want to repeat myself, but yeah, so we should be predicting the future so that we can respond to that. And then there are lots of different ways, lots of different predictions that are already coming out from people who are using analytics, and maybe you've got some as well. I just grabbed this one out, is that, you know, after a certain amount of time and a certain amount of activity on a VLE, this is Rio Salado University, they can start to predict what grade people will get already after only 8 days of activity, which is quite impressive. What does that look like in reality? So any of you who've been looking at analytics, I've just ripped these screenshots because these relate to the analytic engine for our particular VLE. Well, it's about starting to do those data mining, run algorithms on it, and then a lot of visualization and then dashboarding of what is actually going on, and then some sense of the time over which those calculations are being made. So looking at whether we are looking at how real time do we really want to get and what the level of granularity is. So this, at the moment, again, is a growing field. So there is now a new field, well, it's an old field, a field that is coming into education, which is all about visualization. I've been to a number of talks which is simply about how do we visualize information, and that is really an interesting area. The whole infographics element of what we think comes out of analytics is something in itself which is almost a field of study, and is actually an academic field of study in its own right as well. But what we're trying to do is not simply look at one different form of analytics. It's to think about how do we triangulate the things that we're doing, and how do we start to bring together different areas of analysis to give us better modelling and to give us better prediction. One tool, again, that's kind of resurged and has been quite quiet for some time has been social network analysis, which I think now suddenly, again, becomes kind of an interesting area to put alongside doing your learning analytics. So social network analysis, it looks at links and relationships, and it looks at where you sit in a chain of relationships. So it looks at your distance from other people, but it also looks at the quality of the relationships as well, and that's crudely put. So it's not simply having lots of connections that makes you important, it's who your connections are too as well. So particularly when you do social network analysis, you'll start looking for who are the information brokers, because they become very important links in any kind of network, and who are the boundary spanners as well. Who are those people who cross different kinds of communities as well? So when you do network analysis, for example, on an educational setting, you're looking to see where participants, students are maintaining those links, those relationships, and it can be used as an early warning predictor. So this is a tool called Snap, which you can load. This is actually looking at discussion fora. So again, that gets kind of interesting, because this tool is looking at network analysis, it's looking on discussion forum, but also what they're starting to bring in is analysis of the actual discourse that is going on. So dialogic argumentation, and looking at the quality of discussion as well. So lots of tools are kind of converging and starting to have some value as the amount of data builds that we have to analyse. So therefore, the significance of what we're looking at and producing is becoming increasingly important, or increasingly statistically relevant. And finally, for those of you who are looking at management, and management is interested in all of this, then you can then start to map this back to your own internal surveys about student satisfaction. The NSS, iGrad, whatever you might run internally, will all be producing data as well. And you can start to triangulate things, for example, about here, this is from our virtual learning environment, particular questions and data that come out, we can match that back then to our analytics coming off from the VLE as well, and start to go and look and see what is going on in terms of practice and teaching practice on those particular courses, and talk to those particular staff and find excellence in areas, and hopefully bring those staff to spread that excellence out. I haven't got a lot of time, and I am actually near the end, so I'm just going to do this very quickly. The other area that we're just experimenting with is also, just to give you this one, is we've built a computer-supported collaborative lab as well. Now, it was about sharing, teaching people to use CAD packages, and it was a very clever piece of programming, not done by me, but to actually build a system that would both monitor, manage, record and support students during quite large CAD classes. And it did that through a particular interface that was built that allowed both student and academic to see what each other were doing and to switch desktops, etc. So that was a very nice project. But one of the things that came out of this, and again has become quite interesting, is it's allowed us to pick up quite a lot of passive data about, I'll slip down, about what students are doing and how they're doing it and who they're interacting with. So again, we're now starting to look at these kind of systems to model the whole learning environment, to model not simply interactions, discourse, but to look at the space, the learning space as well. So this actually indicated that where you sit in the class affects your grade. And if you sit at the back, you do get bad marks. So it's kind of interesting. So this is something that we're working at the moment, is looking at data here and looking and relating performance to the whole kind of environment, and trying to triangulate that with what people are doing on the virtual learning environment to where they might physically be. And if I go back to think about the Internet of Things, well, just imagine if we start to hook all of that in and we monitor everything we're doing. What predictive models might we be producing then? I'm going to close by just drawing some of this together now. it all sounds very positive, I think it is, but I did raise some issues, and probably you're thinking of your own issues with this as well, is that it does pose quite a lot of questions as well. And I said we are good, and we should be wary and suspicious of what this data is doing, data that we're not necessarily always in control of, and how we do that. So there's a big ethics question about working with this kind of data. There's a legal question as well, and there's a very good link here to a review of the legal issues around data mining and taking data as well, that perhaps institutions aren't really up to speed on at the moment. Data isn't neutral either. Where we pick up data, how we decide to deal with it, which data feeds we choose, it doesn't come neutrally, and nor does the algorithms that we then apply to data are not neutral. It was mentioned this morning, but when, for example, we build software, it becomes imprinted with the software developers' ideas about how that software should be used, the social. And it's the appropriation of tools later that becomes quite interesting. But again, with algorithms, we sometimes forget that they seem very neutral, but they come embedded with a set of values about who designs the algorithms and how they decide to do that analysis. And we don't see that, but that will give us certain kinds of outputs. So data isn't neutral. We're moving into a realm that I kind of remember some time ago as well, about is it the art of teaching or is it the science of teaching? We often hear that, and what worries me is we move slowly, step by step, back towards something that we saw maybe with IMS and other systems, that we move back to the science of teaching, and that worries me, because there is an art to teaching, there's a reality to that. And then, again, because of the visual elements, it's objective versus subjective interpretations, and that leads into this idea about oculocentrism, where what you represent starts to become truth. So you start to see a truth in that particular kind of representation of that, because, I mean, I'll put this up quickly. I mean, okay, this is the map of the London Underground. For many people who come to London, this is the map of London. You know, but if you get out of a tube station, I can assure you that this isn't where everything else is. But I know people who do see this as a map of London. This is a representation that becomes truth for those people, and there are lots of different areas there. So that's a very kind of up for grabs area at the moment, which is why I talked about visualization and infographics. And we have to question what we see and how we interpret it, which we would do when we see a graph. And I think we've learned to do that. So there's a certain visual grammar and a digital literacy, a visual literacy, that we also need to develop, and a skill we need to do is to make sense of that kind of big data and that use. So I just want to wrap up now, because I think I'm bang on 45. So I've looked at two things, and maybe I've raised more problems than solutions in terms of change. But what I wanted to say is I think what we need to have are tools to think about the way that we do things. We need to have tools. They're important. And I've tried to give you two tools here today. The first tool I've given you to think with is to think about design, and to give quite a practical way of doing that, design patterns, and to think about patterns. So that's a tool to think about how we manage some of these issues. And the second tool, although we're quite early into the game, is to think about what analytics does, another tool to help us deal with change and understand what is going on. So I think those are the two important things that I wanted to take away today, is that we need design. We need something that's human. And I want to go back to that, because we need human and is meaningful. It needs to be meaningful on the ground. Because when I talk to people about analytics, they often go, that doesn't mean anything to me. No, we need more than that. We need to be human and meaningful. But we do need models. We need models that are good, that are active, and also effective. They predict well. So we need to keep doing what we're doing, but we need to challenge what is there and make sure we develop good tools to use. So I shall finish there. Thank you.